this session, we're sitting with Zach Kazin, Senior Director of Content Partnerships at Vox Creative. Hi, Zach.
How you doing, Robert?
Good. Zach, to get started, tell us a bit about yourself, your role, and what it is that exactly that you do.
Sure. So I lead the content partnerships team as part of Vox Creative. Vox Creative is a content studio within Vox Media. What that essentially means is we connect brands to audiences through content. Content in our world means anything from micro content and social videos to feature-length documentaries or full custom podcasts, anything in between, experiences, and new innovative formats. Cool. And so what I do is I essentially work adjacent to our sales team and our creatives and creative strategy team to work with brands to figure out what do they want to do in the content space and how are we going to achieve their goals.
And how did you end up in this role?
So I kind of ended up here by circumstance and had adjacent experience, but I'd never actually worked in the world of pitching brands on campaigns. I have said this a zillion times before this job. I never looked at an RFP in my life. Now I look at them all day, every day. I used to work at Red Bull. I ran the global partnerships and programming division for about 4 years there. So what that meant was Red Bull's digital and social platforms. At the time, what that meant was pre-TikTok, Musical.ly, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and then principally the video platforms, YouTube, Hulu, and others, figuring out what kind of programming Red Bull would program as a media company for those platforms. And previous to that, I used to work at AOL. I started a small production company, and I started my career at Lionsgate.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Now, in this role of the creative and the content and the brand interest, where do you see the intersect with innovation and new technologies?
Especially when it comes to brands, right? Like breaking through in what I would just generally say the content marketing space is tricky. And while brands want to do things that are consistent and build audiences and create retention while also selling products or building loyalty, very often what a brand is looking to do is do something breakout. Mm-hmm. Breakout very often means innovative. So 10 years ago, the first time, and I'll just harken back to Red Bull, or at this point it was a little over 10 years ago, they threw a guy in space and live streamed it. The innovative part obviously was the space jump part, but it was also live streaming. At that time, that was the biggest thing YouTube had ever seen. It's still the largest live stream on that platform to date. And that was the innovation, right? That's evolved in a number of different ways, to bring it to live in a different element. Live at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020 was how do we turn every event into a live event? How do we make live events or live streams this interactive experience? And so this idea of innovation, be it through video, through audio, through text-based stuff, through real life stuff, is always sort of at the forefront of what's going to create that buzz and ultimately that halo effect to pair unique, engaging formats with high-level awareness that brands always need. And then, a lot of those use cases, they're thinking about how does it drive a consumer in to actually complete a purchase, mm-hmm. or get to a point of asking for more information where you actually create a connection between brand and consumer.
Mm-hmm. So in essence, optimizing the call to action that the brand needs.
In many ways, yeah. And what it can do, right? It can be, let's say there's the simpler, or call it more of like a KPI-driven format of what you're saying, of like, how do we optimize the way we're creating connection, the call to action, the actual action. And then there's the additional, let's call it like spark, halo effect, PR-able moment of something that's really interesting and innovative, whether that means being first to market or doing it in a really unique way.
In terms of the immersive role of technology, because lines are being blurred a lot from metaverse to social to which way, where do you see the brand's interest lie in the coming years, in the near term, midterm?
It's interesting you say we've been having a lot of conversations about the metaverse lately, and for a number of reasons, one of the big ones being literally Facebook rebranding to Meta. Metaverse has become this big buzzword. I'm not going to speak on behalf of our whole company or creative team, but there is a bit of a wave of us internally thinking it's a little bit overblown. We're talking about something that's been around for a long time. When you think about gaming, gaming has been a metaverse for decades. Mm-hmm. In any case, so I think that's one area that's interesting. I think it's from like one innovation space that's been growing, and especially something that's become a big true business for us at Vox Media is podcasting, right? Like audio in the sense of building audiences, creating new IP formats, using that as a way to expand an existing brand, or in our case, our individual editorial networks, right, has become a big thing. It's also for us been a way that talent comes to the forefront, where historically Vox Media, and I say historically, we're generally 10 to 15 years old with the exception of New York Magazine as a legacy brand. Generally, we're not a talent-driven company, right? Like you don't see a bunch of big names at the forefront of our video content. You see big name journalists, but that's a little bit different. In the audio space, our shows are led by names in many cases, not all. So Nilay Patel, the editor-in-chief of The Verge, runs 2 different podcasts. You have Kara Swisher and Scott Galloway running podcasts. Preet Bharara and his podcast network, Cafe, have joined us. Criminal and the team that runs Criminal has joined us as part of the podcast network. And bring that to sort of the table as part of the equation here is that when there is talent, and in a format like audio, which for a number of reasons that we can get into is very engaging, the consumer connection to that as a medium and as a brand is really interesting. So, and really close. So you hear a podcast host read, and it's a different level of engagement from somebody watching a TV spot or seeing a display ad, because it's someone you trust talking to you. And we've seen a lot of evidence in a lot of ways that kind of advertising is in many ways providing more engagement and lift than others. We love all of our children, all of our ad formats are great.
Yes.
But that one is, I think, is interesting. And then where it's going next has evolved. So like how that plays into innovation in the future is a number of ways, inclusive of the evolution of podcast formats, as well as our ad formats, as well as how we're doing brand-based segments and mini-series and full-on podcast series. And then also the way that podcasts become sort of trial for bigger concepts. I don't think we have done it yet, but I've seen it in the industry where podcasts have become like the pilot for then a TV show. So shows that were first released as a podcast get optioned by a Netflix or an Amazon or so on. So that space is one that's also really interesting to me.
I mean, the growth of podcasting, this whole ambient entertainment has been crazy over the last few years. And I think when it comes to the support structures of content monetization, where do you see the advertisement formats evolving in the podcast arena?
I think so. I started to mention a little bit of how there's like different kind of levels of ads or different ways to weigh in. And the way we look at it is a few ways. So you get, brand gives us their ad spot, pretty straightforward. Standard, basically radio ad turned into a podcast ad, or now they're just podcast first, radio second, maybe. Then there's a host read. Host is reading your creative. Then we have ones that we would call produced reads, where our team is writing a script on your behalf with you, so we're doing all the legwork. Then you click it up further when we say branded segments. And so what that is like take the mid-roll spot in a podcast, usually about 90 seconds, and turn it into a micro story. And so whether that is a story that reflects the brand, whether it's an explainer in audio format, it's essentially micro-branded content, but in audio format. Then you go up further and we say, let's make full episodes. And the way that comes to life is either we'll do a mini-series in partnership with one of our shows. So for example, we have a show called Switched on Pop. It's a show about pop music and musicology, essentially. They have done a few limited runs where we did a partnership with JBL a year ago, where they, of course, are marketing headphones and audio quality, and we did a whole series on anthems. And so they did a full episode on Queen's We Are the Champions. They did a whole episode dissecting jock jams and so on. And so it brings the brand into the affinity in like a really aligned way, but with editorial. And then the last sort of most complex thing we do is we'll launch a net new podcast for a brand. We've had really great success. We work with Ben & Jerry's on 2 different seasons of a show. We've got a show out right now with Mattress Firm, the giant mattress brand that you can buy across the US, that is a podcast about sleep. It's not about Mattress Firm. And so that's a really way that we can get deep into affinities there. And as part of that, right, that goes from full-on content to various types of ad formats. I think where we're going with ads is thinking about how can we think about further measuring attribution with how a brand or how a consumer is engaging with that podcast ad. Right now in the Vox world, most of what our ads are is like, you call them dumb ads, if you will. Like, you just passively listen. You maybe can go get a URL, put it in a website,
Right.
get more information, and so on. We've done a few that are sequential, where you hear one, then you hear the next one that's a little bit more in detail. But I think there's a whole world of where those ads can start to become more interactive, essentially.
Absolutely. And we noticed it actually in terms of our research of the last few years. I guess dumb ads is a bit of a harsh word, but
Yeah.
how do you actually keep your level of engagement with whatever you're doing and still somehow remember taking that URL and putting it into the web browser, which leads me to actually a next little question. What's the first or most memorable radio ad that you remember, the first one that to this day you still remember?
It's unbelievable how terrible my long-term memory is. But the things that come to mind when I think of the ads I remember on the radio are radio DJs advertising the local big blowout concert, right? Like, dial in to get a free ticket or whatever it may be, which is more like a house ad than a brand putting a spot there. But like, that's the thing that comes to mind for me. That's the thing that, like, I remember being like, oh, you're telling me to do something, and there's something I can go do. So that's what comes to mind for me. Yeah.
And thanks again for your time. But just in closing today, and this is interesting from a podcast perspective, where do you see the role of radio, creators, and podcasting converging in the coming years?
I think, well, so a little bit of what I was saying before, where like creators in the audio space have built an incredible, or ones who build up their podcasts, have built an incredible amount of trust with their audiences. And so what they can then instruct their audiences to do, if they believe in the brands that they're partnering with, is really massive. So whether that is in much more in-depth information or guidance around a product or a brand, whether that's, so it's like you take a brand that's, I don't know, a beverage brand, and you're like, oh, go buy it. But maybe it's more of like, this beverage brand's really interested in sustainability, and I, as the host, am also into that kind of thing. Here's what we're doing together as a partnership. And you have the trust and relationship there that I think is really interesting. I also think like levels of taking advertising in the audio space and bringing it into a much more interactive world can be really fascinating, meaning if a creator, right, like you get creative people get their hands on like, what can I do if I can make my podcast experience or just my audio experience interactive, and do anything from your podcast now has a companion show that you can interact with on whatever device you have at home. I think that's really interesting. I think the idea of launching a net new experience in an audio first world is really interesting. There's been some experiments that I've seen through Spotify and through things that you guys are doing with brands that are really interesting. And I think like that's kind of like the tip of the iceberg. The way I think of it is we are so adept and used to the idea of like, someone gave me what I would call like an interactive page on a website or a mobile device, and you can play around with that and do something really interesting. So like you see a wave of people sharing, I don't have a good example off the top of my head, but like a quiz-based thing where you can click around and learn about yourself. All of that has the potential in audio, and perhaps if it gets adopted faster or in any way, it's actually more frictionless than the idea of browsing a site, putting in a URL. You're actually just interacting with your voice.
And gamification, of course.
Yeah,
That's a big one. Yeah.
Exactly. The gamification of it gets really interesting. To harken back to like my gut take on the metaverse, and metaverse is basically gaming masked in corporate suits. And like you think of people who are being innovative and have been innovative in gaming spaces where mobile gaming has risen so much, and simple gaming is such a big thing. I think very often people say gaming, gamers, esports, whatever, they think of the people playing League of Legends or Call of Duty or whatever. You're also the person playing Wordle and Candy Crush. Right. And that kind of thing where there isn't the in-depth complexity of a game like Call of Duty or Fortnite in voice, sky's the limit. Like why isn't there not a Wordle voice version right now? Or that, like, not with words, but whatever you could create in that space. And there's like insane potential there. The other thing that just popped in my mind too is just from a device standpoint, I'm somebody who in the last year or so heavily adopted AirPods.
Right.
In many ways because they're really great at noise cancellation and their mics are good. In other ways because literally I like to pace while I'm on the phone. But I also, maybe on purpose and maybe not on purpose, started getting Siri alerts in my ears when I'm walking and breaking through music or podcasts to tell me messages or whatever, and responding and giving commands without thinking about it, without moving, without picking up my hands. It's amazing. So like the idea of where that can go to is really interesting, of that call and response.
So you see that actually as a growth opportunity for brands to get better, what? Brand awareness?
I look at that part as like true engagement. I think there's the like different stage of that purchase decision, right? Or when you're receiving an ad for the first time, the brand's trying to net you as a new consumer, or if you've heard of them, but like bring you into their fold. So in the analogy to any other kind of ad format, it's like create the awareness and maybe drive down the funnel to an initial purchase. That's you get served what is now potentially an interactive audio ad, and you respond to your voice device and say, yes, no, give me more information, purchase, whatever it may be. In the even more complex way, and this is like, in my mind, I'm walking down the street, I hear more info, whatever, like this is can a brand start interacting with me and providing me with more utility information, whether it's a DIY kind of thing, or it's a sort of product service after purchase, where you're talking about, this is both DIY and after purchase. Like I've bought a piece of furniture and IKEA is going to guide me through the creation of it, and I can ask questions.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
My hands are full, and their instructions are decent. No words, as if you're familiar with IKEA instructions.
Right.
But imagine if you could ask for questions, or ask like, what is this circular little bolt thing that I don't know how it works? And it can actually give you some answers there. That's kind of interesting to me. Workout space, I think it's kind of interesting. Guidance around personal fitness at home could be kind of interesting. And that's where like a brand there can start playing into it. And whether you're the workout brand or you're the brand advertising with the workout platform.
Interesting.
Becomes kind of interesting. But that kind of thing just is like, in theory, is limitless. And what it takes is for each brand and each like platform, if you will. So the platform being the creator, the show, the podcast. My analogy I just made is the fitness brand.
Right.
Pairing with the brand trying to sell a product, figuring out what's the way to do it and get those creative brains and those juices flowing to get some use cases in the world, even more than there are now. Right, there are a lot that are really interesting that people might not even know about, and just go forth. And I think that's what's really interesting there.
So basically a more ambient, less interrupting long-term relationship with the brand. That's more service-oriented, not overbearing.
Yeah, not overbearing, but also, yes, and also the potential to create a stronger actual relationship with your consumer, right? Like that isn't ambient. In fact, it's like a more direct part of that relationship with the brand because it is designed in a way that is convenient and non-interruptive and interactive in the sense that a user can initiate and stop, but come back to it. I think that's kind of interesting.
Are there strategies in your industry that actually are banking on this and are planning with this? Do you see movement towards that?
Yeah, I see it. The biggest signals with the brands that I'm working with, like in the Vox world, is just how much the adoption towards audio through podcasting has increased in the last, even while I've been there for 4 years, dramatic, like truly dramatic. The way that we've been able to go from, let me talk to you about audio and podcasting and hope you get it a little bit, to multi-year or multi-month upfront deals with brands buying spots, to brands who are asking specifically to launch branded podcasts, even if they don't know the ins and outs. Like that is a signal that there's a recognition of how much time people are spending with the voice devices, and with audio devices, voice devices being part of it. And the thing that I think ultimately brands, brand leaders, agencies that rep them are always going to come back to, how am I measuring success? What is this working? What are the metrics that show me that this is on par with or better than other formats? And the reason underlying the rise of this audio interest, the metrics don't lie. They're showing that it's working. Yeah. Brand studies are showing that people are having better recall for ad formats in this place. And so, like, for me, the signal for where interactive can only make it better is, you talk about something like brand recall or success metrics or engagement metrics. Interactivity is an obvious way to tick that up further. So I think it's coming, right? Like, yeah. It's happening already, but I think it's going to grow even further.
No, this was fantastic. Thank you so much for your time today.
For sure.
And I'm looking forward to sending you these updates that we're finding out about this trip.
Love it.
Thank you very much.